Of course. This is a story I have to tell. It's not something you brag about at dinner parties, but it's the truth of what happened in the last year of my life. The crystal champagne flute felt unnervingly light in my hand, a delicate, hollow thing in a room thick with false sentiment. From the podium at the front of the Gold Ballroom in Wilmington's Hotel DuPont, my business partner of 40 years, Leo Haas, was wrapping my life into a neat, palatable narrative for the crowd. He called me a brother, a genius, a titan of industry, and as he said it, he looked right at our CFO, Caleb Thorne, who gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. That nod was the first crack in the foundation of my world, the tiny tremor before the earthquake that would swallow my entire life's work whole. Leo raised his glass, his voice booming with practiced sincerity, and so, we present Arthur with this token of our immense gratitude, a retirement package befitting the man who built this company with his bare hands. He and Caleb walked toward me, not with a portfolio of documents as I'd expected, but with a single, slender envelope. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The envelope was crisp, cream-colored, bearing the familiar logo of Pendleton and Haas Innovations, the company I'd co-founded in a rented garage in 1983. My name, Arthur Pendleton, was typed neatly on the front. Inside wasn't the multi-million-dollar buyout agreement for my 40% stake, the culmination of a lifetime of grueling work and sleepless nights spent perfecting chemical formulas that had revolutionized the manufacturing industry. It was a single cashier's check for $50,000. And a letter. My hands, usually so steady after decades of handling volatile compounds, began to shake. The letter, printed on heavy bond paper and signed by Leo and Caleb, was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. It spoke of recent, aggressive market downturns, unforeseen liabilities, and strategic devaluations of company assets. It explained, in cold, legalistic prose, that my shares, my legacy, were now functionally worthless. The $50,000, it stated, was a discretionary severance bonus, a gift. A pittance. I looked up from the paper, my breath catching in my throat. The ballroom was a blur of smiling faces, colleagues, employees, even my own children, all applauding a lie. My eyes found Leo. He was standing beside Caleb, his arm draped casually over the younger man's shoulder. Leo's face was a mask of avuncular warmth, but his eyes, those dark, predatory eyes, told the real story. They were gleaming with victory. Caleb, ever the smug prodigy, wore a thin, contemptuous smile. He looked at me not as a mentor or a partner, but as a relic being cleared out to make way for the new regime. He was 35. I was 65. In their eyes, the fight was already over. They had used my trust as a weapon and my impending retirement as an opportunity. They had hollowed out my company from the inside, siphoning away 4 decades of my genius into some dark corner of their balance sheets, and left me with an empty shell. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of my own success, I wasn't a titan of industry. I was just an old man who had been publicly, brutally, and efficiently erased. They hadn't just stolen my fortune, they had stolen my name, my history, and they had done it with a smile, a handshake, and a round of applause. The weight of the champagne flute was suddenly unbearable. I set it down on a passing waiter's tray, the gentle clink lost in the roar of my own silent humiliation. The drive home to our house in Greenville was a silent one. My wife, Eleanor, sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee, a small, warm pressure in the cold, cavernous space that had opened up inside my chest. She hadn't needed to read the letter. She had seen it all in my face, and the way Leo and Caleb had stood together, a pair of triumphant vultures. She knew. When we got home, I went straight to my study. The room was my sanctuary, lined with mahogany shelves holding everything from first-edition chemistry textbooks to the framed patent for my first major invention, an epoxy resin that had become the industry standard. That night, the patents felt like tombstones. I sat in my leather chair for hours, the letter and the check on the desk in front of me, a monument to my own staggering naivety. $50,000. It was less than the cost of the imported marble in Leo's new kitchen. It was an insult wrapped in a legal document, designed to be so outrageous that I would be too stunned, too ashamed to fight back. They were counting on my age, on the assumption that I was a tired old man who would simply fade away. For a week, they were right. I was paralyzed. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I had trusted Leo. He was the best man at my wedding. Our children had grown up together. He was the showman, the salesman, the dealmaker. I was the scientist, content to live in my laboratory, chasing molecular bonds and solving impossible equations. I had left the business to him, the finances to the brilliant, fast-talking Caleb he'd insisted we hire 10 years ago. "Arthur, you're the talent," Leo would always say, clapping me on the shoulder. "Let us handle the boring stuff. You just keep making magic." It turned out the most creative work happening at my company wasn't in the lab, it was in the accounting department. The first spark of defiance came not as a roar, but as a quiet, nagging question. How? How could a company that had posted record profits for 8 straight quarters suddenly be worthless? How could assets, patents worth hundreds of millions, a state-of-the-art production facility, a global distribution network, simply evaporate? It defied logic. It defied the fundamental laws of conservation that governed my entire world. Matter and money cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be moved. I started with what I had, boxes and boxes of old quarterly reports, performance reviews, and project files I'd kept in my home office. It was a chaotic archive of a life's work, but it was my work. I began to build a timeline, not of chemical innovations, but of financial decisions. I cross-referenced hiring dates with new corporate filings I found on the Delaware Secretary of State website. I mapped out cash flows and asset allocations, my old legal pads filling up with frantic, sprawling diagrams that looked more like complex molecular chains than financial charts. Eleanor would bring me coffee in the morning and a glass of scotch at night, never asking what I was looking for, just letting me work. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. It started around the time Caleb Thorne was hired. Small, new LLCs began to appear in the company's filings, listed as consultants or service providers. They had innocuous names: Tri-State Logistics, Apex Chemical Sourcing, Atlantic IP Management. The payments to them were small at first, buried deep in the operating expenses. But over the years, they grew, becoming a quiet, steady drain on the company's revenue. Then I found it. A single line in a 2018 annual report under the Research and Development section. It mentioned the termination of a research initiative codenamed Project Chimera, writing it off as a non-viable dead end. I remembered that. I had developed a new class of synthetic polymers with incredible tensile strength, but the final stage of curing was unstable. I'd shelved it, intending to return to it later. Leo had been unusually insistent that we formally abandon it, that we file the paperwork to declare the research a loss for tax purposes. At the time, I thought it was just good financial housekeeping. Now, I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. A chimera. In mythology, a creature made of the parts of different animals. On a hunch, I started searching for the LLCs not just in Delaware, but in known tax havens. I spent $200 on an online corporate records service. And there it was. Registered in Nevis, a tiny island in the Caribbean with airtight corporate secrecy laws, Chimera Holdings, Limited. Its listed directors were anonymous, represented by a local law firm. But the date of its incorporation was exactly 1 week after we had officially written off Project Chimera at Pendleton and Haas. They hadn't written it off. They had moved it. They had created a separate, invisible entity and funneled my most promising, albeit unfinished, intellectual property into it. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The small, steady payments to those other shell companies, they weren't payments for services. They were a way to bleed money out of the parent company, Pendleton and Haas, and into their shadow operation. They were starving the main business, the one I had a stake in, to secretly fund the development and patenting of my own work under the banner of Chimera Holdings. They were building a new company in the dark, using my resources, my inventions, and my name, all while telling me I was the revered patriarch of a struggling business. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud. I searched the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office database, not for patents assigned to Pendleton and Haas, but for anything related to synthetic polymers filed in the last 5 years by an unknown entity. There it was. A patent for a revolutionary new adhesive, Syntho-bond 7. The application was filed by Chimera Holdings. The formula described in the patent was unmistakable. It was my work. My unstable polymer. But the final page detailed a new curing process, a simple, elegant solution using a vanadium catalyst. It was the solution I had been days away from discovering before I was distracted by another project. The solution Leo had known I was close to. He hadn't just stolen my past work. He had stolen my future. He had taken the last brilliant thought of my career and signed his name to it. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it left me speechless. They weren't just thieves. They were architects of a grand illusion, and I was their masterpiece of deception. And the worst part? It was all perfectly legal, a labyrinth of corporate law designed to be impenetrable. They were untouchable. The weeks that followed were a blur of impotent rage. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, young man from a small firm in Wilmington who looked at my mountain of papers with a weary expression. He confirmed my worst fears. "Arthur, what they've done is brilliant," he said, and I could tell he was impressed despite himself. "They've used the letter of the law to gut the spirit of the law. They created a structure where Pendleton and Haas pays exorbitant licensing fees to Chimera to use the technology that you, an owner of P&H, invented. These fees, along with other consulting costs, create the losses that devalued your shares. Meanwhile, all the profits accumulate offshore in Chimera, which they own entirely. It's a closed loop. We can sue, but it will take years. Millions in legal fees. They'll bury us in discovery, motions to dismiss, they'll bleed you dry and you'll likely never see the inside of a courtroom." He was right. Leo and Caleb had the best corporate defense team in the state on retainer. They had anticipated this exact move. My $50,000 gift wouldn't even cover the initial filing fees. I was a man with a rowboat trying to attack a battleship. Their power was absolute, and they flaunted it. An article appeared in the Delaware Business Times announcing Leo Haas as the sole innovator behind Syntho-bond 7, the miracle adhesive that was already securing massive contracts in the aerospace and automotive industries. It included a picture of Leo and Caleb, smiling, arms around each other, standing in my lab. The article painted me as the beloved founder who had gracefully stepped aside, passing the torch to a new generation. They called me the grandfather of the company. It was a public castration. Caleb bought a sleek, minimalist penthouse in Philadelphia, featured in an architecture magazine. Leo's wife posted pictures of their new yacht, the Chimera, on her Instagram. They were living a life of obscene luxury on the foundations of my genius, while Eleanor and I were quietly selling off stock portfolios and canceling travel plans, the specter of an uncertain future looming over us. I saw Leo once, at the Wilmington Country Club. He was holding court at the bar, laughing, his face flushed with expensive scotch and success. He saw me, and for a moment, his smile faltered. But it was replaced by something worse, pity. He raised his glass to me in a mock toast, a king acknowledging a peasant, before turning back to his adoring audience. The message was clear: I won. You are nothing. That night, I hit rock bottom. I was in my study, the lawyer's words echoing in my head. They'll bleed you dry. The walls felt like they were closing in, the patents on the wall mocking me. I was 65 years old. My name, once a mark of respect in my industry, was now a footnote in a story where Leo was the hero. My legacy was a lie. I was a ghost in my own life. Eleanor found me just after midnight, slumped over my desk, the room dark except for the glow of my computer monitor displaying an article about Chimera Holdings' projected billion-dollar valuation. She didn't say anything at first, just rested her hand on my shoulder. Her touch was warm, steady. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. I shook my head, the weight of my defeat too heavy for words. "I can't fight them, Elle. They're too big. Too smart. They've won." She turned my chair to face her and knelt down, taking my hands in hers. Her eyes, the same clear blue eyes I'd fallen in love with 45 years ago, were filled not with pity, but with fire. "They are not smarter than you, Arthur," she said, her voice fierce. "They're accountants. They're salesmen. They move money around. You rearrange the building blocks of the universe for a living. You see things no one else can see. You solved the C7 polymer degradation problem when everyone said it was impossible. You developed the catalyst for the metstatins that saved thousands of lives. Do you remember what you told me when you started the company? You said the world is governed by unbreakable rules. Chemistry. Physics. You said you just had to find the right formula." Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity. She was right. I had been trying to fight them on their battlefield, the courtroom, the balance sheet. A world of paper and lies. But my battlefield was the lab. My weapons weren't lawsuits, they were elements, compounds, reactions. The world is governed by unbreakable rules. And so was my creation, Syntho-bond 7. Leo and Caleb knew the formula, the one they'd patented. But I knew its soul. I knew its secrets. In my mind's eye, I saw the beautiful, complex chain of polymers that gave the adhesive its strength. But I also saw something else, a ghost in the machine, a whisper of a vulnerability I had discovered during my initial research. A flaw I had never documented because I had deemed it statistically irrelevant under normal manufacturing conditions. A tiny, elegant, catastrophic flaw. A new energy surged through me, cold and clear and pure. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was purpose. They were about to sell my company, my life's work, to a German chemical conglomerate, AG Chemikalien, for just under $1 billion. The deal was set to close in 90 days. They thought they were selling a miracle. But I was going to make sure that when the time was right, they would be selling a time bomb. I wouldn't sue them. I wouldn't try to outlawyer them. I would give them exactly what they had paid for. I would let my creation, my beautiful, flawed, stolen creation, deliver my revenge for me. I looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in months, I smiled. "You're right," I said, my voice steady again. "It's time to get back in the lab." The vulnerability in Syntho-bond 7 was a beautiful, esoteric thing. It wasn't a weakness in the traditional sense, it was more like a hidden keyhole. The polymer chains were cross-linked with a proprietary curing agent, creating a bond that was, for all intents and purposes, indestructible. But I had discovered during early stress tests that if a specific, rare earth-doped organic catalyst was introduced into the base polymer mixture before curing, even in infinitesimal amounts, parts per billion, it would create microscopic fractures in the final crosslinks. The bond would still form. It would pass every single quality control test, tensile strength, shear viscosity, thermal resistance. It would hold perfectly for a period of time, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. But then, triggered by simple atmospheric humidity, a slow, inexorable process of hydrolytic degradation would begin. The catalyst would cause the polymer chains to, in essence, digest themselves. The indestructible bond would fail, not with a snap, but with a quiet, viscous surrender, turning into a useless, gelatinous ooze. It was a chemical ghost, untraceable after the reaction, leaving behind only its catastrophic results. It was the perfect weapon. My first move was to liquidate a substantial portion of our retirement portfolio, a move that terrified me, but Eleanor stood by it without question. It gave me a war chest of just over $500,000. It was everything we had left, a single bet on myself. Leo and Caleb had built their empire on a complex web of shell corporations. It was time for me to create my own. With the help of my lawyer, I established a blind trust, which then formed an LLC with a bland, forgettable name, Mid-Atlantic Material Solutions. I was a ghost, buried under layers of legal paperwork. My target was not Pendleton and Haas directly. Their security was too tight, their processes too controlled. But a company of that size has a vast, complex supply chain, and in my obsessive research into their finances, I had found a weak link. To cut costs and pretty up the balance sheets ahead of the sale to the Germans, Caleb had recently terminated a long-standing contract with a major chemical supplier and switched to a smaller, cheaper, independent producer in rural Pennsylvania, a company called Aliquippa Organics. I knew them. They were a small, family-owned outfit, reliable but perpetually struggling. They supplied one of the key precursor chemicals for Syntho-bond 7, a liquid polymer resin. Their quality control was good, but it wasn't designed to detect the kind of microscopic sabotage I was planning. Through my LLC, I made an offer to buy Aliquippa Organics. The aging owner, tired of the razor-thin margins and constant pressure from bigger clients, was overjoyed to sell. The deal was quiet and fast. Within 2 weeks, I was the silent owner of a key supplier to my old company. I never set foot in the place. I managed it through a hired plant manager, a young, ambitious guy who was just happy for the job and asked no questions. I gave him only one new directive: all shipments to Pendleton and Haas were to be personally supervised by a specialist from the parent company to ensure enhanced quality control. That specialist, of course, was me. I rented a small, anonymous lab space in a commercial park in Lancaster, an hour's drive from the Aliquippa plant. There, I synthesized a small batch of my catalyst. It was delicate, exacting work, the kind of pure chemistry I hadn't practiced in years. It felt like coming home. The catalyst itself was a pale, viscous liquid, indistinguishable from a dozen other industrial solvents. I stored it in a simple steel canister. The day came. I drove to the Aliquippa plant in a rented Ford pickup, wearing a generic blue lab coat and a baseball cap pulled down low. I was Mr. Smith, the specialist from Mid-Atlantic. No one gave me a second look. The order for Pendleton and Haas was for 500 drums of precursor resin, a massive shipment. Under the guise of taking final samples for analysis, I was left alone in the loading bay with the sealed drums. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat. This was the point of no return. My hands were steady as I used a syringe to inject a precise, calculated amount of the catalyst through the rubber seal on each drum. 250 milliliters per 500-liter drum. An untraceable, ghost-like quantity. It was enough. I resealed the punctures with a dab of industrial epoxy, one of my own, ironically, and vanished. The truck carrying the 500 tainted drums rolled out of the Aliquippa plant an hour later, a slow-moving fuse heading straight for the heart of Leo and Caleb's empire. I watched it go, then drove back to Wilmington, the empty canister on the seat beside me. The trap was set. The time bomb was ticking. Now, all I had to do was wait for the world to find out. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The world kept turning. Pendleton and Haas stock continued to climb in anticipation of the AG Chemicalian acquisition. Leo and Caleb were everywhere, lauded in the financial press as visionary leaders who had turned a respectable but stagnant company into a billion-dollar powerhouse. I watched them from the shadows of my study, my anger a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I tracked the tainted batch of precursor through my contacts at the Aliquippa plant. I knew it had been processed, used to create thousands of gallons of Syntho-bond 7. I knew that finished product had been shipped out to their most important clients, automotive manufacturers in Detroit, aerospace engineers in Seattle, high-tech construction firms in Chicago. I had poisoned the bloodstream of their success, but the patients still looked perfectly healthy. Eleanor was my anchor. She never once asked if I was having second thoughts. She just made sure I ate, that I slept, that I remembered to see the sunlight. My own plan was now in motion. I spent my days drafting a document. It wasn't a legal complaint, it was a story. A meticulously detailed, evidence-backed narrative of Leo and Caleb's fraud. I laid out the timeline, the creation of the shell corporations, the transfer of intellectual property, the flow of money into Chimera Holdings. I included copies of the old quarterly reports, the corporate filings from Nevis, the patent for Syntho-bond 7 next to my own lab notes from years earlier. I compiled it all into a single, encrypted file. I also wrote a separate, anonymous letter, supposedly from a disgruntled employee at Pendleton and Haas, and addressed it to the lead investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal who covered the chemical industry. The letter didn't mention the fraud directly. Instead, it raised concerns about Caleb Thorne's aggressive cost-cutting measures, specifically mentioning the switch to less reliable suppliers like Aliquippa Organics. It hinted that the incredible performance of Syntho-bond 7 might be too good to be true and that the company might be cutting corners on quality control to inflate its value before the sale. I was planting a seed of doubt, creating a narrative that would make sense of the chaos to come. The first tremor hit on a Tuesday morning, 26 days after the shipment. It was a small news item from a Detroit automotive trade publication. A major car manufacturer was issuing a limited recall on a new line of luxury sedans due to supplier component failure in the chassis assembly. The report was vague, but it mentioned an issue with structural adhesives. I felt a jolt, a surge of vindication. It was beginning. 2 days later, the second tremor. A much larger one. A prominent aerospace company announced it was grounding its entire fleet of new commercial drones, citing catastrophic material failures in the wing mounts. Their stock dropped 7% in an hour. The name of the adhesive supplier wasn't mentioned, but the financial news channels were buzzing. Pendleton and Haas's stock wobbled, dipping slightly on the speculation. Leo issued a confident press release, stating their products exceeded all industry standards and that they had no reason to believe their adhesives were involved. He was lying, but he was calm. He still believed he was in control. The final day arrived. The day of the signing. The board of AG Chemicalien had flown in from Germany. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. in the main boardroom at Pendleton and Haas headquarters, the very room where I had been celebrated and discarded. At precisely 1 p.m., I sent 2 emails. The first, containing the full dossier on the Chimera fraud, went to the enforcement division of the SEC. The second, the disgruntled employee letter, went to the journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Then, I went into my garden with Eleanor, sat on our favorite stone bench, and turned off my phone. I had lit the fuse. Now, I wanted to listen to the birds sing while the world burned down. I had no way of knowing what was happening inside that boardroom, but I could imagine it. I could picture Leo, his face beaming, his expensive pen poised over the final contract. I could see Caleb, smug and triumphant, already mentally spending his share of the $1 billion. And then, the earthquake would hit. The reports would start flooding in. Not just from Detroit and Seattle, but from everywhere. Skyscraper windows in Chicago coming loose from their moorings. Medical device casings falling apart in hospitals. A cascade of catastrophic, inexplicable failures, all pointing back to one company, one product. The calls would start. Panicked clients. Furious lawyers. And then, the call from the Wall Street Journal. The Germans, meticulous and risk-averse, would not just walk away from the deal, they would run. The $1 billion valuation would evaporate in minutes. The stock would collapse. And in the wreckage, the SEC investigators would come knocking, my dossier in their hands, to pick through the bones. The silence of the garden was profound. Eleanor reached over and took my hand. "It's done, isn't it?" she asked. I nodded, my throat tight. It was done. The quiet ticking I had heard in my head for a month had finally stopped. The sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the heavy knot of shame and anger in my chest began to loosen. The bomb had gone off. The fallout would be immense, but it would be theirs to endure. I had fought them on my battlefield, with my weapons. I had used the laws of chemistry to enforce a law of my own: you do not steal a man's life's work. It was nearly dusk when I finally turned my phone back on. The screen lit up with a dizzying barrage of notifications. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages and news alerts. The headlines told the story in stark, brutal terms. Pendleton and Haas sale collapses amid catastrophic product failures. SEC launches fraud investigation into P&H executives. Stock plummets 98% in after-hours trading. It was more complete, more devastating than I could have ever imagined. The Wall Street Journal had published their story, a damning exposé that not only detailed the product failures but also heavily featured the leaked information about Caleb's cost-cutting and the convenient timing of the company's inflated valuation. My anonymous tip had given them the perfect narrative hook, and they had run with it. The financial ruin was only the beginning. The article mentioned that federal authorities were involved, citing anonymous sources, likely from the SEC, who confirmed an ongoing investigation into complex offshore arrangements. My dossier had landed. That night, we opened a bottle of wine that we had been saving for our 50th anniversary. We didn't talk about Leo or Caleb or the money. We talked about our first house, about raising our children, about the future. It felt like the end of a long, terrible fever. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, played out in the newspapers and on TV. Leo and Caleb were arrested in a pre-dawn raid at their homes. The images were stark: Leo, the charismatic titan of industry, in a rumpled bathrobe, his face pale and slack with shock. Caleb, the boy genius, hiding his face from the cameras, his arrogance finally shattered. The case against them was overwhelming. My dossier provided the roadmap, and the subsequent investigation unearthed every dirty secret, every illegal transfer, every lie. They were facing decades in prison for securities fraud, wire fraud, and a dozen other charges. The company, Pendleton and Haas Innovations, the entity I had poured my life into, was forced into bankruptcy. Its name was now synonymous with failure and corruption. Its assets, including the now infamous Syntho-bond 7 patent, were to be liquidated to pay off a mountain of lawsuits and creditors. My lawyer called me 6 months after the signing day that never was. "Arthur, it's time," he said. The bankruptcy court was auctioning off the intellectual property assets. The patents. My patents. Because of the public scandal, they were considered toxic, worthless. No major corporation would touch them. We were the only bidder. For the price of pennies on the dollar, less than what was left of the money I had used for my war chest, I bought back every single one of my life's innovations. Chimera Holdings was dismantled by federal authorities, its assets seized. But the patents themselves, the pure intellectual property, were now mine again, held by a new, small company registered in my name and Eleanor's. Pendleton Labs. We're sitting in the garden again. It's a warm spring afternoon. The roses Eleanor planted are in full bloom. In my hand is a letter. It's not from a lawyer or a reporter. It's from a young researcher at Johns Hopkins. She's read some of my early papers on polymer chemistry and has a theory about how my work could be adapted for a new kind of biocompatible medical implant. She's brilliant. She reminds me of myself, all those years ago. Eleanor comes and sits beside me on the bench, leaning her head on my shoulder. She looks at the letter in my hand and then at my face. She can see the spark there, the one she thought might have been extinguished forever. "Was it worth it?" she asked softly. "All of it?" I look down at my hands. They're the hands of a 66-year-old man, wrinkled and spotted with age. They are hands that built an empire, hands that signed it all away, and hands that, in the end, ground it all to dust. They took the money, but they forgot. I still owned the formula. The end.